Just a nurse. That is what Dr. Sterling Mercer whispered to the hospital administrator 47 minutes before Margaret Walsh's shift began, his voice carrying the particular disdain reserved for people who folded linens and changed bedpans for a living. He didn't know that she had carried a Navy SEAL through 2 miles of hostile fire in Baghdad with a collapsed lung. He didn't know that the quiet woman in the basement laundry was the reason Commander James Hargrove still drew breath. She was unraveling his entire fraud scheme with nothing but meticulous handwriting and a photographic memory for numbers that didn't add up. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It brought the Pentagon to her doorstep. Margaret Walsh moved through the basement laundry facility of Cedar Creek Medical with the kind of mechanical precision that came from having done the same task 10,000 times. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like cicadas trapped in plastic, casting their sickly pale glow across rows of folded linen stacked in geometric perfection. Cotton sheets. Pillowcases. Hospital gowns the color of seafoam, each one creased with corners that formed 90-degree angles. Her hands moved automatically now, muscle memory that required no conscious thought. Fold. Crease. Stack. Fold. Crease. Stack. The rhythm was almost meditative if you didn't notice the slight tremor in her fingers, not fear, not nervousness, but the kind of trembling that came from holding tension just below the surface. The kind that came from 6 years of looking over your shoulder. She was on her 100th pillowcase when she felt him watching. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway, his presence making the air pressure change like the moment before a thunderstorm. He wore his white coat like armor, the kind of man who had never folded a single piece of laundry in his entire life, never worked a shift that paid $16.50 an hour, never understood that people like Margaret existed in the spaces between important things. He was the head of surgery at Cedar Creek Medical, which meant he moved through this hospital like a man who owned it, his shoes clicking against the tile with the confidence of someone who answered to no one. Odd, he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, the kind of voice that belonged in a mahogany-paneled office, not in a basement that smelled of detergent and hot metal. You seem to spend a lot of time down here. Margaret didn't stop folding. The pillowcase in her hands became a rectangle, then a square, then a perfect parallelogram. I work here, doctor. Yes. For 6 months now. He stepped further into the laundry facility, his shoes clicking in that precise rhythm that men like him perfected, a rhythm that said I belong everywhere. Tell me, do you ever leave the basement? When I'm assigned to the floors. Assigned. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that predators wear. That's an interesting word choice. As if someone is telling you where to go. Margaret set the pillowcase down on the stack and met his eyes. Hers were the color of a winter Atlantic, flat and impossible to read. She had been trained to show nothing, to be a mirror that reflected back only what people expected to see. A nurse. A staff member. A woman who had no significance, no history, no story that mattered. Is there something you need, doctor? He stared at her for exactly 3 seconds. His jaw tightened, a microscopic tell, the kind that most people would miss. But Margaret didn't miss anything. She was trained to see the small movements, the patterns, the deviations from baseline. She saw the calculation in his eyes as he reassessed her. Saw the moment he decided that his original plan needed adjustment. No, he said finally. Nothing at all. But that was a lie. And Margaret understood, in that moment, that something had changed. Something about the way he was looking at her suggested that she had done something without meaning to. Something that had triggered a response she didn't yet comprehend. Later, in the orthopedic wing on the 3rd floor, Margaret moved between patient rooms with the efficiency of someone who had done this job thousands of times. Room 343. Room 344. Room 345. She checked vitals, adjusted for placements, logged observations in the patient charts with a level of detail that went beyond what the hospital required. Where most nurses wrote alert and oriented, Margaret wrote patient alert and oriented X3, responding to verbal commands, slight grimace when left shoulder palpated, requested additional pain medication at 14:33. Every number. Every observation. Every detail that might matter. Room 347 held a man named Commander James Hargrove. He had been admitted 3 days ago following what the chart described as a training accident, a fall from rappelling equipment that had fractured 2 ribs and bruised him extensively. He was Navy SEAL, which meant he moved through pain the way other people moved through air, with practiced indifference. His chart listed his age as 41, his service record as E-classified, and his next of kin as his father, a 2-star admiral stationed at the Pentagon. When Margaret entered his room, he was sleeping. His left forearm rested across his chest, and on that forearm, visible in the afternoon light coming through the hospital window, was a tattoo. Black ink, faded with age. A single word, Nightingale. She stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds. Her hands, which had been moving with such mechanical precision all morning, went absolutely still. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless fluorescent hum. A monitor somewhere down the hallway beeped its rhythmic rhythm. The hospital breathed around her, the sound of ventilators, the distant voice of a code blue announcement, the squeaking of stretcher wheels on polished tile. "Good afternoon, Commander." Margaret's voice was steady, measured, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that emotion could be compartmentalized and stored in the same way she stored the flag in her locker. "How is your pain level this morning?" His eyes opened slowly, pupils dilating as he focused on her face. She saw the moment his brain searched for a match, saw the small frown as recognition failed to materialize. The medications they had given him, oxycodone, diazepam, the standard post-trauma protocol, had clouded his memory, softened the edges of his mind. He was looking directly at her, at the face he had last seen in Baghdad in 2015, and seeing nothing but another nurse in scrubs. 4, he said. Maybe a 5. I'll have Dr. Mercer adjust your prescription. Margaret checked his 4 placement, verified the saline drip was flowing correctly, logged his vitals in the hospital system. Pulse 72. Blood pressure 119/78. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. She moved with the kind of precision that came from having done this thousands of times, but her mind was elsewhere, compartmentalized, stored away, processed through systems she had trained herself to use. It wasn't a request. It was something she had decided the moment she read his name in the system that morning. In the supply room on the 3rd floor, Margaret performed her afternoon inventory with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything she did. The hospital ordered morphine in 1 mg vials, fentanyl in preloaded syringes, saline in bags of varying sizes. She cross-referenced each item against the supply logs, checking the names of the doctors who had ordered them against the patient charts to verify that the medications matched the documented procedures. That was when the discrepancies began to appear. Dr. Mercer's surgical orders showed 5 procedures in the past 2 weeks. Margaret pulled the patient charts. 4 procedures existed in the hospital system. 1 did not. The 5th surgery, listed as an emergency appendectomy on a patient named Robert Chen, had never happened. The patient was discharged 2 days ago in perfect health, his chart noting that his appendicitis had resolved on its own without surgical intervention. Yet the surgical supply log showed that Dr. Mercer had ordered a full surgical kit for that exact date and time, instruments billed at $847 per procedure, surgical gloves at $12 per box, syringes, drains, sutures, anesthesia equipment. She wrote the discrepancy down in her personal log with the same mechanical precision she used for everything else. Chen, Robert. Procedure code 47.0109. Date 08/14. Cost $4,200 in supplies for a surgery that never occurred. The supply room door opened behind her. Dr. Mercer stepped inside, and the air pressure changed again. Working late. His voice carried a casual quality that didn't match the intensity of his gaze. Finishing inventory. You're very thorough. He moved closer, and Margaret could smell the expensive cologne he wore, something with notes of cedar and leather. The smell of money. The smell of a man who had never had to apologize for anything. Almost obsessively so. It's important to keep accurate records. Yes. He smiled. Accurate records. That's important. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, far enough that he maintained the illusion of professional distance. His eyes scanned her chart, taking in the details she had documented. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The supply room was silent except for the hum of the refrigeration unit that kept certain medications at the proper temperature. "You seem like someone with a military background," he said quietly. Margaret's hands went absolutely still. "I don't know what you mean." "The way you move. The way you document things. The way your eyes track exits." He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw something like respect flicker across his features, the kind of respect you gave to an opponent once you realized what you were facing. Someone trained. Someone disciplined. "I'm a nurse," Margaret said. "Yes. Just a nurse." He set down the chart she had been writing in and walked toward the door. "How long have you worked for Cedar Creek Medical, Miss Walsh?" 6 months. "And before that?" "Various positions." "In Raleigh?" "Across the country." He paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame in a gesture that suggested he had all the time in the world. Behind him, she could see the hallway of Cedar Creek Medical extending in both directions, the orthopedic wing to the left, the ICU to the right. The hospital where Commander Hargrove lay sleeping in room 347 with a tattoo on his arm that no one else could read. The hospital where she was supposed to be invisible. "Be careful about asking too many questions," Dr. Mercer said. His voice was soft, almost conversational. "People sometimes ask questions they're not equipped to understand the answers to." Then he left, his footsteps clicking away down the corridor. Margaret stood alone in the supply room for exactly 17 seconds. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly that morning, were now absolutely steady. She looked down at her chart, at the notation she had written in her meticulous handwriting about a surgery that never happened. About a $5,000 fraud that should have remained invisible. She had made a mistake. She had done her job too well. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer now knew she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and his expression as he left the room had suggested he was already planning how to make her disappear. Room 212 smelled like antiseptic and fear. Margaret adjusted the 4-line on 7-year-old Tommy Dawson's arm, her fingers steady as she recognized what the other nurses had missed, the infiltration site swelling, the catheter pressing against his vein wall instead of flowing freely. The boy's mother watched from the bedside chair, tension visible in the set of her shoulders. Margaret's voice stayed soft. "The line isn't flowing properly. I'm going to reposition it so the medication reaches him correctly." She was finished in 40 seconds, the drip rate returning to normal, Tommy's pain visibly lessening. That's when the door opened. Dr. Mercer entered with the precision of a predator recognizing wounded prey. His white coat was immaculate, his expression surgical sharp as he took in the scene, Margaret's hand still near the 4, the Dawson family looking relieved. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Nurse Walsh, step away from that patient immediately." His voice cut through the air like a blade. "Your unauthorized contact violates every protocol we have." Margaret's hand froze mid-withdrawal. Mrs. Dawson pulled Tommy closer, confusion and fear mixing on her face. The boy's heart monitor accelerated slightly. Children sense danger the way animals sensed weather changes. "Doctor, the 4 was infiltrating," Margaret began, keeping her tone level, explanatory. "The medication wasn't. Was being handled by qualified staff before you decided to play hero, Basement Betty." He let the nickname hang in the air like a stain. His gaze moved to the Dawsons. "I apologize for the interruption. You'll understand that housekeeping staff occasionally overreach their scope of practice." The smile he offered them was warm, practiced, a surgeon's smile that conveyed absolute authority. "I'll personally monitor Tommy's from now on." Mrs. Dawson nodded uncertainly, pulling back from Margaret. The shift in the room was instantaneous, Margaret transformed in their eyes from helpful caregiver to boundary-violating outsider in a single sentence. Tommy looked confused, his small hand reaching for Margaret before his mother gently redirected it. Margaret took one measured breath. Her composure didn't crack. She didn't flush or tremble or retreat. Instead, she met Mercer's eyes directly, that flat, level stare that had looked across Baghdad rooftops through rifle scopes, and spoke in a voice so quiet the heart monitor almost drowned it out. "I've served beside men who died with more honor than you'll ever possess." Then she turned and left, closing the door with the precision of someone who understood that silence carried more weight than rage. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room emptied within seconds of her arrival. She'd sat down with her lunch, a container of rice and vegetables she'd prepared that morning, and pulled out her phone. Within moments, Nurse Chen stood abruptly, gathering her half-eaten sandwich. Two others followed immediately, their movements coordinated, deliberate. The room cleared like she carried contamination. Through the glass partition, Margaret watched Mercer cluster with the remaining staff near the medication dispensary. His voice didn't carry, but his hand gestures were theatrical, designed to draw attention. She caught fragments. Security concerns. Background issues. Previous employment history doesn't align. The whispers began immediately, spreading like thermal bloom on infrared. Margaret ate mechanically. Each bite was an act of defiance, a refusal to acknowledge the exile. Her jaw worked steadily, her breathing controlled. Around her, the empty break room felt vast and cold, the fluorescent light above humming its mechanical song. The clock on the wall clicked from 1:14 to 1:15. She was finished eating alone by 1:23. 2 days passed. The third humiliation was public and calculated, designed not for privacy but for witnesses. The write-up appeared on the unit board at the nurse's station at 7:44 a.m. during shift change. Margaret didn't post it, Mercer did, his handwriting precise, his words chosen with the careful malice of someone who understood how institutional documentation could weaponize itself. The paper was white, the header bold, Margaret's name in capitals at the top like an accusation carved in stone. Disciplinary action, insubordination. Nurse Walsh questioned a prescribed morphine dosage, undermining physician authority and delaying patient care. Action required, written response within 48 hours. The crowd gathered within minutes. Whispers built like pressure. Margaret stood reading it, her hands at her sides, her face composed as marble. The morphine dosage she'd questioned was 12 milligrams, dangerously high for a patient with renal compromise and respiratory depression history. She'd prevented an overdose. But there was no space for her defense on the form, no line that explained why a nurse with sharp eyes and sharper instincts had hesitated to administer a medication that might have killed the patient quietly, legally, without a single question asked. Mercer appeared 15 minutes later, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. He stood near the station, ostensibly reviewing charts, but his position allowed him a clear view of her face. He was waiting for the break, for the moment when her composure would fracture, when she'd defend herself or cry or show some sign that his campaign was working. Margaret turned to find his eyes on her. She held the contact for exactly 4 seconds, then returned to her work. Her movements never wavered. Her breathing never changed. The trembling wasn't fear. The silence was restraint. What he didn't know was that she'd survived worse. Infinitely worse. The afternoon shift brought a new admission to room 347, Commander James Hargrove, recovery pending from a training accident, his chest wrapped in compression tape, his Navy ID badge clipped to the hospital gown. The chart noted a collapsed lung that had been treated at a trauma facility. He was stable now, drowsy from pain medication, his dark eyes unfocused as the nurses cycled through their intake vitals. Margaret checked his oxygen saturation at 3:06 p.m. The pulse oximeter read 97%, excellent. She adjusted his pillow with the same meticulous care she gave every patient, hands that had once carried a man through 2 miles of hostile fire now simply ensuring his comfort. Hargrove didn't look at her. The medication kept him floating, kept him from recognizing the woman his forearm announced with perfect clarity in faded ink. The tattoo was there, small but unmistakable, just above the wrist bone. A bird in flight, a nightingale, wings spread wide, detail etched in black that spoke of hours in a tattoo parlor and years of memory beneath it. The call sign from Baghdad. The name he'd used when she'd run the ruck march in full combat load, carrying his body weight plus his trauma, the collapsed lung whistling like a punctured tire with every hard breath. She'd been Captain Margaret Walsh then. He'd been First Lieutenant James Hargrove. They'd been operating under JSOC Task Force designation in Fallujah, Jolan District, supporting a direct action raid. The extraction went sideways when an IED detonated 500 meters from the rally point. She'd carried him through enemy fire, through a district that had become a meat grinder, and the Pentagon had decided that nobody ever needed to know it happened. Hargrove slept. Margaret checked his already infiltrating slightly, the line beginning to fail. She made a note on his chart and flagged the nurse station for a replacement. The work was automatic, muscle memory from 6 months of hospital protocols and 6 years of field medicine before that. She didn't flinch at his presence in the room. The voice in her head that used to calculate field medicine, pain is data, blood loss trajectory, respiratory compromise progression, that voice was quiet now, compartmentalized into a person she couldn't be anymore. But it was still there. Waiting. The hospital descended into evening routine. Visitors cleared out by 7 p.m. The hallway shifted to nighttime skeleton crew, fewer nurses, more distance between rooms, the quality of light changing as the sun dropped beyond the western tree line. Margaret finished her shift at 8 p.m., her last action to check Hargrove's vitals one final time. His oxygen saturation had drifted to 94%, still safe, still within parameters. She didn't know that 2 days from now, his oxygen would drop to 68. She didn't know that his chest would expand asymmetrically, that tension would build in his thoracic cavity like pressure in a collapsing building. She didn't know that the code team would freeze, that a moment of hesitation would stretch like taffy in the crisis room. And she didn't know what hands would save him. Margaret clocked out at 8:07 p.m., walked past the break room where no one sat, and headed toward the basement locker where she kept her few belongings. The folded flag was there, pressed carefully behind her extra scrubs, the fabric worn soft from being touched thousands of times. She pressed her hand against the locker door and stood there in the basement silence, the hum of the laundry machinery distant but present, like the sound of a helicopter that never quite landed. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Dr. Mercer's office door closed with a soft click at 6:44 p.m. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly pale wash as he settled into his leather chair, the kind that cost more than most nurses made in a month. 3 board members sat across from him, Patricia Hayes from administration, Richard Sterling from finance, and James Conrad, the hospital's legal counsel. Their faces carried the particular exhaustion of people who'd already worked 12 hours and were being asked to work 3 more. "Thank you for staying late," Mercer began, his voice carrying the warmth of a man about to deliver bad news with genuine regret. "I've been reviewing some personnel matters that require your attention, and I thought it best to handle this quietly, professionally, before things escalate." Patricia leaned forward. "What kind of matters, David?" "Irregularities in employment history," Mercer said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Our new floor staff member, Margaret Walsh, the one who's been here 6 months in the laundry rotation, appears to have fabricated significant portions of her resume." Richard opened the folder, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. "What kind of fabrications?" "According to her application, she worked at 3 separate hospitals before Cedar Creek. I had my assistant make some preliminary calls this afternoon to verify employment dates, and the responses were concerning." Mercer paused, letting the weight of that word settle. "St. Mary's in Charlotte has no record of her employment. Riverside in Durham claims they've never heard of her. When pressed about potential patient endangerment issues from her tenure, one supervisor got very quiet. Very quiet indeed." James Conrad, the lawyer, set his pen down. "You're saying she lied on her application?" "At minimum," Mercer said. "At worst, she's a fraud using a false identity. I'm deeply troubled by the safety implications. We have protocols for a reason, background checks, reference verification, credentialing through proper channels. If someone circumvented those systems, we have exposure. Patricia's jaw tightened. Have you spoken to her? Not yet. I wanted the board to be aware first, so we're protected if this becomes a legal matter. I've taken the liberty of contacting the State Licensing Board's investigative unit. There's an inspector named Chen who specializes in credential fraud. He'll be here Monday morning to conduct a full review of her employment documentation. The words moved through the room like a toxin entering the bloodstream. Richard set the folder down carefully. What do you recommend? Immediate reassignment, pending investigation, Mercer said. Remove her from any patient-facing duties. Restrict her access to sensitive areas. And, frankly, I'd suggest you prepare a termination package. If this is what I suspect, she won't be employable by the time Chen finishes his review. James leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. This is serious, David. If we move against her without cause and this turns out to be clerical error. It's not clerical error, Mercer interrupted, his voice dropping to something almost confidential. I've worked in surgery for 23 years. I know the difference between an honest mistake and deliberate deception. She's hiding something. The question is what and why. Better to act now and be wrong than to wait and discover later that we hired someone with a criminal past or a false identity. The three board members exchanged the kind of look that happens when powerful people have already made a decision but need to pretend they're still deliberating. Patricia nodded slowly. Monday morning. Chen conducts his review. First thing. I'll personally ensure he has full access to her file and her work area. He'll need to speak with her, obviously, but the investigation should be thorough and, above all, discreet. Richard gathered the folder. We'll authorize it. What about her immediate status? Mercer smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd already thought several moves ahead. I'm reassigning her effective tomorrow. Moving her to the basement laundry exclusively, it's where she started, so it won't raise immediate suspicion. I'm also beginning formal documentation of her policy violations. That for adjustment incident with the Dawson family. I'm filing an official write-up for an authorized patient contact. There's also the matter of her insubordination when she questioned my medical judgment regarding the morphine dosing on the Turner case last week. Did she question your judgment? Patricia asked carefully. She expressed concern about a dosage I'd authorized. In my 23 years, I don't take medication suggestions from floor staff. It was disrespectful to the hierarchy of the unit and showed poor judgment on her part. I'm documenting it as insubordination. James Conrad was already thinking like a lawyer. If she contests the termination, we need paper that supports our decision. This documentation, does it reflect actual policy violations, or are we creating a paper trail? Mercer's expression didn't change. It reflects her conduct as I interpreted it, based on hospital protocol and professional standards. That's what documentation does, James. It protects the institution. The room held a particular kind of silence, the silence that comes when men with authority recognize another man exercising his authority in ways they find simultaneously troubling and useful. I'll expect updates, Patricia said, standing. And Mercer? Handle this carefully. If there's any appearance of retaliation or unjust termination, it reflects on all of us. There will be no appearance of anything improper, Mercer assured her. Just a thorough investigation into questionable credentials and appropriate administrative response. They left his office at 7:14 p.m., leaving Mercer alone with the hum of the ventilation system and the particular satisfaction of a man watching his plan move into execution. He picked up his desk phone and made 4 calls. The first was to St. Mary's in Charlotte, speaking to a supervisor in respiratory care who owed him a favor from a conference 5 years prior. When the state calls about Margaret Walsh, he said carefully, I'd appreciate if you confirmed she worked there for 2 years and left under circumstances that concerned you regarding patient safety. Nothing specific, just that concern. Can you do that for me? The supervisor hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, then agreed. The second call was to Riverside in Durham, where a former colleague now ran the nursing department. "Robert, it's David Mercer from Cedar Creek. I need a small favor. An investigator may contact you about a nurse who falsified her employment history. If asked, can you confirm she never worked at your facility and express your concerns about what kind of person would misrepresent their background?" The third call connected him to the State Licensing Board's investigator unit. "Robert Chen, please. This is Dr. David Mercer, Chief of Surgery at Cedar Creek Medical. I'm reporting a potential credential fraud matter that requires investigation." By 7:31 p.m., Robert Chen had a file opened and was scheduling Monday morning. The fourth call was to the HR department's after-hours line, where Mercer left a message for the director. "This is Dr. Mercer. Effective tomorrow, I'm removing Margaret Walsh from her current rotation. She's to be reassigned to basement laundry duties exclusively, pending investigation into her employment history. Please prepare formal documentation citing policy violations and insubordination related to incidents from her current tenure. I'll provide the specifics tomorrow morning." By 7:45 p.m., Margaret Walsh's entire employment status was in motion, like a chess piece being moved toward checkmate by someone who'd planned the endgame before she even knew the game had begun. She didn't know it yet, standing at the laundry folding station with a cart of surgical linens, her hands moving through muscle memory, hospital corners on fitted sheets, surgical drapes folded into precise thirds, towels stacked in descending height. The antiseptic smell of bleach hung in the basement air, mixing with the metallic tang of the industrial washers humming their rhythmic complaint. Her phone had buzzed twice with alerts about Commander Hargrove, routine vitals checks from the nursing station system, and both times she'd noted the readings: oxygen saturation dropping incrementally, respiratory rate climbing by 2 breaths per minute. Something was changing in room 347, and she couldn't be there to see it. When she arrived Tuesday morning at 6:15 a.m. for her shift, Patricia Hayes was waiting in the HR office with an assignment sheet. "Margaret, Dr. Mercer has requested your reassignment. Effective immediately, you'll be working basement laundry exclusively. Full-time. Your schedule begins at 5 a.m. daily." Margaret took the sheet. No explanation. No reasoning. Just a reassignment that happened to move her away from the unit where Commander Hargrove was recovering, away from the high-visibility areas where she'd been performing for adjustments and catching medical errors. Away from anywhere she might see something Mercer didn't want her to see. "May I ask why?" Her voice was level, composed, the voice of a woman who already understood that asking questions was an act of compliance, not challenge. "Dr. Mercer felt it would be a better use of your skill set," Patricia said carefully, not quite meeting her eyes. "The basement operation needs more dedicated support." Margaret knew it was a lie. She also knew that asking for truth from institutional power was like asking water to flow uphill. The signal was clear: she was being disappeared inside the building. That evening, as she folded surgical drapes in the basement, Detective Robert Chen sat in Dr. Mercer's office reviewing a file that contained 3 forged employment verifications, a state licensing board inquiry letter, and a carefully curated paper trail of alleged policy violations. Mercer had included photographs of the incident with the Dawson family, images that made Margaret's interaction look like a violation rather than a life-saving intervention, and documentation of her insubordination regarding the morphine dosage, written in language that made professional concern sound like personal defiance. "She'll be questioned tomorrow," Chen said. "Of course," Mercer replied. "I want to cooperate fully with the investigation. Whatever it takes to get to the truth." What happened next didn't just silence the room. It prepared the trap that would snap shut in exactly 48 hours. The code alarm screamed from room 347 at 2:08 p.m. 3 short bursts. The sound that meant something had turned to nothing in seconds. Margaret was 2 rooms away, changing linens in 3:45, when her body recognized it before her mind did. Not the alarm itself, every nurse heard those. The rhythm of it. The cadence. The particular pitch that meant airway. Meant dying. Meant now. She was moving before conscious thought caught up, muscle memory taking the wheel the way it always did when time collapsed. Through the doorway. 3 strides. Room 347. Commander James Hargrove's chest was expanding wrong. Asymmetrically. His left lung collapsing inward like a fist closing around his heart. His lips were already blue. The young nurse, barely 24, hired last month, stood frozen beside the bed, her hand hovering over the call button as if proximity to it would somehow make the code team materialize faster. They wouldn't materialize fast enough. The code team was on the opposite wing. 60 seconds minimum. Maybe 90. Hargrove's oxygen saturation was already dropping past 80%, the heart monitor showing the compensatory tachycardia of a body in free fall. His eyes found hers for one instant, terrified, drowning, and something in Margaret's chest crystallized into absolute clarity. She moved to the crash cart. Grabbed the 14-gauge needle without hesitation. The plastic wrapper tore between her fingers with a sound like dry leaves. This was a violation. Dr. Mercer had explicitly removed her from Hargrove's care 48 hours ago. This was insubordination. This was assault with a deadly weapon by his lawyer's definitions. This was the only thing that would keep him alive. "Commander, stay with me." Her voice came out steady. Conversational. As if she weren't about to drive a needle between his ribs. "I'm Captain Margaret Walsh. I'm going to decompress your chest. You're going to feel pressure. Then you're going to breathe." His eyes widened. Recognition flickered, not of her face but of her voice. Of something older than memory, something written in his nervous system from Baghdad. From 2 miles of hostile fire. From hands that had carried him through worse. She palpated his second intercostal space with 2 fingers, found the landmarks with the precision of someone who'd done this in a tent without electricity while mortars fell like rain. The needle penetrated the skin. Through the fascia. Between his ribs with the same steady pressure she'd used 8 years ago when he was dying in her arms in a bombed-out marketplace. The hiss of released pressure filled the room. Not violent. Not dramatic. Just air escaping, the sound of pressure equalizing, of a collapsed lung re-inflating itself. His oxygen saturation climbed immediately. 85. 90. 92. His eyes stopped rolling. His shoulders dropped. The code team arrived 90 seconds later, finding Hargrove breathing, his vitals stabilizing, Margaret standing beside him with a needle still in place and her hand steady as surgical steel. The attending physician, Dr. Richardson, took in the scene in a single glance. Tension pneumothorax. Decompressed. Perfectly executed. He looked at Margaret. "You did this?" "Yes." "The patient was removed from your care?" "Yes." Dr. Richardson didn't respond. He didn't need to. He walked to the head of the bed and began the next phase of Hargrove's treatment, working around Margaret's presence with the efficiency of someone who understood that some violations were acts of heroism and some were crimes, and the difference wasn't legal, it was whether the patient lived. Dr. Mercer arrived 90 seconds after that, his face darkening as he processed the scene. The crash cart. Margaret's positioning. The perfectly placed needle. The climbing oxygen saturation. Everything that proved she'd moved against his direct orders. "What have you done?" His voice was quiet. Dangerous. The tone of a man whose strategic brilliance had just been undercut by a person he'd considered incapable of anything but laundry. Margaret turned to face him, her expression unchanged. "Saved his life. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. While explicitly removed from this patient's care. Do you understand what you've just done? You've assaulted this man with a needle. You've committed a crime and destroyed any credibility your credentials had." The staff in the room froze. This was it. This was the moment Mercer had been constructing for 6 months. The moment when Margaret's competence became her liability, when her refusal to retreat became insubordination, when saving a life became evidence of dangerous instability. Mercer's voice rose, addressing the gathering medical staff. This is exactly the kind of reckless, unauthorized behavior that the state investigation will address. This woman has a fabricated resume, unverifiable references, and now she's performing emergency procedures outside her scope of practice. He turned to Richardson. I'm assuming we'll be documenting this incident. Dr. Richardson looked at Hargrove, whose chest was now rising and falling normally, whose oxygen saturation had stabilized at 94%, whose heart rate was dropping into the normal range. Already documented, Richardson said quietly. Unauthorized needle decompression by nursing staff. Patient outcome, stable and breathing. I'll be noting the intervention saved this man's life. But Mercer was already moving, his phone in his hand, his face fixed with the expression of someone who'd just decided to burn the entire system down if it meant getting what he wanted. Within the hour, the machinery he'd spent 6 months building accelerated into overdrive. 3 board members received calls, the same calls they'd been half expecting, the foundation he'd laid in careful conversations about personnel concerns now becoming urgent. References from Margaret's previous hospital were contacted with specific questions about patient endangerment and judgment failures. Investigator Chen was summoned to Cedar Creek with a formal complaint about the dangerous unauthorized medical procedures. And by 5:48 p.m., Margaret received the termination papers. Effective immediately. For cause. Conduct unbecoming. Unauthorized medical procedures. Fraudulent credentials pending verification. The language was precise. Professional. Devastating. There was no room in it for the fact that she'd just saved a man's life. The language of institutional protection didn't have vocabulary for that. Margaret read the papers once. Then she folded them into thirds and placed them in her locker next to her employee handbook and her shift rotation schedule. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when she spoke to the HR representative, was level. I understand, she said. I'll be out of the building in 30 minutes. The basement laundry facility was where she'd started 6 months ago. The industrial washers still hummed their mechanical rhythm. The fluorescent light still cast everything in that particular institutional white. The folding table where she'd spent 277 shifts was empty except for a single stack of navy blue scrubs, her personal set, the one she'd brought from home because the hospital-issued ones were always a size too large. She unfolded them once more. Laid them flat on the table. Then she began folding them with the same precision she'd once used to fold the flag of her fallen teammate, the flag she kept in her locker, the only physical proof that she'd ever been anything except a woman with a fabricated resume and dangerous instincts. Each crease perfect. Each corner aligned at exactly 90 degrees. The flag, when she'd folded it 8 years ago, had taken her 40 minutes. She'd done it slowly, honoring the ritual, understanding that it was the last time she'd touched something that mattered in that particular way. A reminder of who she'd been. A reminder of why she couldn't be that person anymore. These scrubs took her 8 minutes. The same precision. The same care. The same understanding that she was performing a ritual of closure. The basement was empty except for the sound of industrial washers and the hum of fluorescent lights. 6 months of teaching, of healing, of holding this hospital together through the sheer force of competence nobody recognized, and she was leaving it the same way she'd arrived, folding things in a basement while the world above continued without her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in saving Commander Hargrove, she'd surfaced. For one moment, she'd stopped hiding. She'd used the hands that had carried a Navy SEAL through Baghdad. She'd used the voice that gave orders to men and women who would die for her. She'd revealed the one thing she'd been instructed, very clearly, never to reveal. And now the people who'd buried Captain Margaret Walsh, the people at Naval Special Warfare Group, at JSOC, at the Pentagon, they would be looking for her? It was only a matter of time before they found her. She folded her scrubs into a perfect rectangle. Set them on the empty shelf. Closed her locker door with a soft click that echoed through the basement laundry facility like the closing of a coffin. Then she heard footsteps on the basement stairs, quick, angry, multiple sets, and something in the building above shifted. The balance of power. The weight of secrets. The moment when everything she'd hidden for 8 years started to crack open. The footsteps got louder. The footsteps got louder. Derek burst through the staff entrance carrying a lockbox, his 17-year-old frame shaking with something between fear and purpose, his voice cracking as he said, "Mom, they need to see these." The box hit Mercer's desk like a gavel. Silver star. Purple heart. 2 more purple hearts. The medals scattered across the termination paperwork like evidence at a crime scene, catching the fluorescent light in ways that made the entire conference room go absolutely still. Commander Hargrove was standing in the doorway, still pale from his recovery, still wearing the hospital wristband, and the moment his eyes found those medals, something shifted behind his eyes. His hand moved to his forearm where the tattoo lived beneath the sleeve. His voice came out in a whisper that carried the weight of 8 years, "Nightingale." Jesus Christ, that's Nightingale. The room's temperature seemed to drop. Board members who'd been reaching for pens to sign the termination stopped mid-motion. Hospital attorney Patricia Chen lowered the document she'd been preparing and picked up the folded citation instead, her voice steady and authoritative as she read aloud, "For conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy forces in Baghdad, Captain Margaret Walsh carried a wounded officer through approximately 2 miles of hostile fire while managing a collapsed lung, demonstrating extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for personal safety." Each word landed like a hammer. Mercer's face drained of all color. The strategic advantage he'd built over 6 months, the calls to board members, the fabricated credential fraud, the state investigator he'd weaponized, all of it suddenly felt as thin as paper in a hurricane. The doors opened again. Not hospital security. Not administrators. A 2-star admiral in dress blues walked in flanked by 2 Pentagon staffers carrying briefcases, their movements carrying the kind of authority that made the room's institutional hierarchy instantly irrelevant. Admiral Morrison's presence made the air pressure change. He didn't shake anyone's hand. He simply nodded at Margaret and said, "Captain Walsh. We've been looking for you for 2 days." Commander Hargrove's father, Joint Chiefs Liaison, made an inquiry about the nurse his son kept asking for. "Took us a while to connect the dots. You've been teaching us a masterclass in staying invisible." His eye shifted to Mercer like a targeting laser finding its mark. "And doctor, we need to talk about $1.2 million. State investigator Chen spread financial documents across the desk with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. Purchase orders for surgical equipment that never appeared in operating rooms. Medicare billing codes for procedures that matched those orders perfectly, too perfectly. A systematic fraud spanning 36 months. "Dr. Mercer," Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of case closure, "you've been ordering supplies through Meridian Medical Distribution. Company where your brother-in-law is CEO. Then billing insurance for surgeries that correlate exactly with those orders. The equipment never reached Cedar Creek Medical." Board member Patricia Hollis stood abruptly, her chair scraping against tile like a gunshot. "How much?" "Conservative estimate, $1.2 million over 36 months, Chen replied. Captain Walsh's charting was so meticulous it became the roadmap we needed. Every discrepancy she flagged, every supply order that didn't match the procedures, she documented it all. Mercer's strategic network collapsed in real time. The board members he'd called in favors from now backed away, creating physical distance as if proximity to him might become contagious. His attorney stood and said 4 words, "I cannot represent you." The state investigator he'd weaponized against Margaret produced a warrant for his financial records, her voice steady as bedrock. "We're seizing your personal accounts and your brother-in-law's company records effective immediately." Hospital security arrived, not escorting Margaret out, but escorting him out. Mercer's composure shattered like dropped glass. "This is absurd," he protested, his voice rising in pitch, desperation bleeding through the cracks in his authority. "Walsh's charting is unreliable. She's a ghost. She doesn't even legally exist." Admiral Morrison's response came quiet and devastated. "Captain Walsh exists enough to have saved 17 lives under fire, Doctor. Your attack on her credibility just ended your career." The words hung in the air. No one spoke. The only sound was Mercer's breathing, ragged and broken, as security placed a hand on his elbow. As they led him past Margaret toward the exit, Mercer made one final attempt, a desperate strike at the only target within reach. "You think you've won? You're still nobody. You hid who you were. You were folding laundry like Eve." Margaret took one measured breath. Her voice came out quiet, measured, devastating. "I folded laundry the same way I folded the flag for my fallen teammate. With honor. You wouldn't understand honor." The silence that followed was absolute. Mercer's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Security continued escorting him toward the door, and no one watched him go. Every eye in the room was on Margaret, on the woman they dismissed, the one they'd tried to destroy, the one who'd been saving lives while folding linens in the basement. Commander Hargrove approached her slowly, his movements carrying the careful respect of one military operator acknowledging another. Up close, she could see the recognition in his eyes, not the medicated confusion from 2 days ago, but clarity. "Nightingale," he said, his voice steady now, "I never forgot you. I just couldn't see past the medications, the years, the time that changed us both. But the tattoo, I got it the day I came home because you were the reason I made it home." Derek moved to his mother's side, seeing her fully for the first time in his life. Not a hospital worker. Not basement staff. His mother. A captain. A legend. His voice came out small, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" Margaret looked at her son, this young man who'd risked everything by opening that lockbox, by carrying those medals into a room designed to destroy her. "Because some debts of honor require silence," she said. "Until they don't." The Admiral stepped forward with a folder that looked official, important, substantial. When he handed it to Margaret, his handshake was firm and respectful. "Captain, we need combat medic trainers. The Navy's losing people because medics aren't trained right. People like you, people who understand what it means to stay calm under fire. We need Nightingale back. If you're willing." Margaret opened the folder. Orders. Official military orders. A new designation. A return. A homecoming 8 years in the making. 6 months later, Captain Margaret Walsh stood in dress uniform at Naval Hospital Camp Lejeune, teaching a room of 30 combat medic candidates the exact needle decompression technique she'd used to save Commander Hargrove's life. The classroom smelled like starch and antiseptic. The folded flag from her fallen teammate, 13 stars visible in the precise military fold, now sat in a display case in her office, a reminder that some debts can never be erased, only honored. Derek visited on weekend leave from his own Navy training, proud enough to tell everyone within earshot that his mother was Nightingale. "She's a legend," he'd say, and watch people suddenly understand why Margaret could silence a room with a single sentence. Commander Hargrove served as guest instructor, rolling up his sleeve to show the faded Nightingale tattoo to each new class. "This woman carried me through hell," he told them, his voice carrying authority they instantly recognized as earned. 2 miles of hostile fire. Collapsed lung. She didn't flinch. Learn from her. Be like her. The new medics hung on every word, every demonstration, understanding they were being trained by someone who'd lived the scenarios they were learning to manage. Across the country in Raleigh, Dr. Mercer, stripped of his medical license, facing 8 years in federal prison for Medicare fraud, made $16 an hour driving a medical supply van for Meridian Medical Distribution. The same company he'd used to steal from. The same equipment he'd once diverted for profit, he now delivered in cardboard boxes that smelled like industrial packing tape and regret. He wheeled those boxes past the nurses' station at Cedar Creek Medical, and former colleagues looked through him as if he'd become invisible. The institutional mirrors reflected a man who'd mistaken title for power, who'd destroyed himself by attacking someone whose strength he couldn't recognize. In the basement laundry, a new nurse folded linens with precision. Mercer saw his own reflection in those mirrors, a cautionary tale. A man who'd had everything and thrown it away trying to eliminate nothing. Margaret's final words to her combat medics echoed what she'd learned through fire, through Baghdad, through 8 years of silence. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Never forget the difference. The camera held on the folded flag in her office, 13 stars catching the light as helicopter rotors sounded in the distance, another class of medics heading to deployment, trained by the legend who refused to stay hidden when someone needed saving. The rotor wash shook the windows. In that sound was the future, a woman who'd carried one SEAL through hell, now training hundreds to carry others. The cycle continued. The honor endured. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in heroes who work in silence until the moment demands they step forward, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us, and comment below. Have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were far more than you imagined?